Hello, I'm still, well, deeply up to my neck in finishing off the non-fiction book that I've been working on for the last few years. So I want to get a video done for today. I know some people have found there have been three I think in a row with media related, the TV series Rome, HBO drama series, and then we did one on the Unmagnificent Seven Rules for Battles. I'm simply doing the things at the moment that I can manage in a short time, because the finishing off the book, and as it happens I've now been asked to finish it off earlier than it was due, means that I'm snowed under with work. So I hope to get clear in a week or two, but at the moment this, I think, it's been quite a while since I recorded something only the day before I'm going to post it, so everything is quite last minute. Today I thought we would do something a little bit different, and we're going to look at that rarest of thing, an eyewitness account in an ancient source of a Roman battle. In this case written by Sulpicius Galba, who's fighting in the civil war of 43 BC that's developed after the assassination of Julius Caesar and then the breakdown of relations between Mark Antony as consul and the liberators, the conspirators, call them what you will, and their supporters in the Senate. And people are starting to divide in different ways. The young Caesar, Octavian, whatever you want to call him at the moment, is opposed to Antony, siding with the Senate, but that's going to change in the aftermath. In this particular case, you have a letter written by a senior Roman officer the day after he's taken part in a battle, talking about it, not at great length, but nevertheless at making a few points of interest. And it's so rare to get this. Obviously, you do have those ancient authors that took part in some or all of the events they describe. So, Thucydides, although admittedly he doesn't really say very much about his part in the Peloponnesian War before he's mentioned third person sent off into exile because he's blamed for not protecting Amphipolis, which has just fallen to Brasidas and his what I was going to say, Spartan force. He's probably perhaps the only Spartan with a few other senior officers there. The rank and file are all mercenaries or helots and all that sort of thing. But anyway, that's getting too complicated. Big one obviously is Xenophon in with the Anabasis, where he was part of this mercenary force, the 10,000, and describes events in which he played a significant part. He's certainly there. So that's, adds to the interest. Caesar obviously wrote this in his commentaries, but they're written in such a style, and only occasionally does he tell us what he's actually doing. Now, we'll talk more about that in future. There's the video on Caesar as a general already up. But you also have Josephus in the taking part in the Jewish rebellion, partly in the Jewish war, but also in his life, his autobiographical shorter account, which gives you some slightly more worm's eye view of some of the operations in Galilee before the big siege of Jotapata, where he'll get captured. Ammianus Marcellinus was present in some of the things. Again, you get those eyewitness details that you don't tend to get elsewhere. There were more works written by people who were actually present, most of which haven't survived, so far more commentary, but also Plutarch cites letters written by Scipio Aemilianus. Most of the sections of Polybius's work dealing with Aemilianus's campaigns, the fall of Carthage, for instance, those haven't survived, but they get references in Appian and elsewhere where Polybius talks about things he actually saw. So you do now and again, but what's rare is to get the equivalent of the modern letter describing it afterwards, or diary, or that sort of personal thing. The papyri, writing tablets, that sort of stuff we get from Roman soldiers, Roman officers. They deal with the vast majority time-wise of any soldier's life, and that's routine, day-to-day stuff. They don't tend to deal very much with the fighting. You have, there's a chap in Egypt who writes home to say he's in hospital, he's been injured during a riot, and this thing. You get little glimpses, but there is very, very little. So it's all the more exciting and interesting when we do get that. Now, I will at some point do rather more about eyewitness accounts and their usefulness and their problems, the potential pitfalls you have as a historian reading this sort of stuff. We've just in the last week celebrated the 80th anniversary of VE Day here it's been celebrated in Britain and around the world. I was hoping to get something done for that week, but it didn't really happen. And obviously, it's been quite interesting when various journalists and the like have been talking to the handful of surviving veterans. They are getting to be very, very few now because they're all in their high 90s or even older. And that sense of trying to give an impression of what it was actually like to be there, which was really what I was aiming to do in Hill 112, the novel. And it's as close as I could make it to the reality, and it's based on what I've heard, what I've read, all this sort of thing. Very much that personal perspective of life at the time, life in the army at the time, and then the experience of the campaign, and other things just that I think are just how soldiering works, and particularly in the British Army, but a lot of others, the things that happen to you and the things that are done. So that's a great interest. At some point we'll talk about the marvellous resources you have in this for the Napoleonic era, particularly for the Peninsular War and especially Waterloo, where you have these far more vivid accounts, but you do see some of the issues there, and hopefully in our interview series we'll get, I've got one historian in mind who's done a tremendous amount of work with this sort of thing, and he has said yes to me, but I need to try and organise things and get that done, because it's interesting to look at the sort of material you get and the difference between something that is written down at the time and is more immediate and might be confused because you didn't quite know what was going on. You don't necessarily know how many enemies there were, what units they were from, what they were doing. There will be all sorts of rumour, all sorts of scuttlebutt flying around during and in the immediate aftermath of a battle or on campaign. Things that people tell you but don't prove actually to be true, but the stories that are circulating, the confusions, the things you don't understand, the things you don't yet know because nobody's been able to sit down and work out, okay, precisely what happened. We think we know what we did, but what was everybody else doing? How you get lots of information there that is different in nature, but as time passes, people, first of all, they get to discuss things. So sometimes, as with any event, you will almost agree a story. It's an amalgam of all the different viewpoints of people talking afterwards. But then over time, an official story breaks out. So particularly in the case of Waterloo, you have really a sort of early Victorian story of Waterloo from the British perspective that includes lots of things that even made their way into the 1970 Waterloo film that probably aren't true, that are stories that first circulate from somebody who wasn't there, and then because they're a good story they get repeated. You see this very much in Memoirs of the Peninsular War, that once Napier wrote his very successful, very famous, very rhetorically flourishing history of the Peninsular War, people who write their memoirs were then conforming to that. And it's understandable. A lot of people who were there will read histories about it because they want to understand better their own part. Again, particularly they like to hear nice things said about their unit or this sort of thing, but also just that sense of, well, what was it really all about? This is something that they will live with all their life, so how do they deal with it? Both as an important thing, an exciting thing. You've got the memories of comradeship, you've also got the memories of the dreadful things as well, the losses, the fear, all that sort of thing, and you're trying to process that. But it does mean people start telling you that's what happened, and later on you can start repeating that as well. Or you tell anyone what you think they want to hear. And you found this, with a lot of survivors of the Great War, that as time went on, there was almost a narrative they were being pushed and expected to conform to emphasise, the mud, the trenches, the rats, all this sort of thing, that simplified things and turned it into a stereotype that is the popular image. Or also you will find that those will be the bits selected that would be repeated on documentary and all this sort of thing. Anyway, I will talk more another time about the problems and pitfalls of using these sorts of personal accounts and these sorts of primary sources of that type. And again, we'll always have in mind the Duke of Wellington quote about, as well write the history of a battle as the history of a ball, because each individual sees what's going on around them, doesn't necessarily remember the sequence of when things happen, and is quite selective. Some things stick in your mind, some things don't. And it's very, very clear. You could speak to people that, even in very advanced years, there were clearly certain memories that were absolutely vivid for them. Moments where everything came back, and perhaps a smell would be associated with it, or a particular event, particular moments. My mother's in her 90s now, and her memory of being a child in the Blitz in Cardiff, sort of late 1940, early 41 were the heaviest, but there were other attacks because they lived quite near the harbour. The docks in Cardiff were very, very important. So, and there was also the other side of the river from their house, there was an ammunition factory. So even though, you have to wonder how precise the bombing was for things like that in 1940 at night, nevertheless, as most of it was, although she does also remember her mother, my grandmother, taking my mother and my aunt to see the first German bombs falling on Cardiff docks in the daytime. I remember my grandmother took my brother and I to see a hotel burning down. So, folk in those days had a fairly basic sense of what was entertaining, and there was that sense, oh, something notable's happening. This is all before television in particular that deluges us with images, let alone now what's available online of how you see things that are happening all over all these disasters, and to some extent get a little bit desensitized. Anyway, my mother's talked recently about having nightmares because there's so much on the news from various war zones, but then a lot of material talking about the Second World War, the bombing, the home front, these sorts of things, brings back these memories. And similar things would spark my father, who was an apprentice in the Merchant Navy during the Second War, and then the British Army in the later stages and afterwards. There were certain things that would just bring back. So it's certainly the case that people can remember very vividly, very accurately, at least some of their experiences throughout their lives, whereas most of us know from when you're suddenly asked to remember something from 20-30 years ago, you bump into a friend who says, oh, do you remember old so-and-so, and you don't necessarily. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Incidents that they remember have drifted from your memory. Again, you might get sparked by going to a place. I gave this lecture series in Oxford for the Pharos Institution a few months back, which will eventually be on their website. And going back to Oxford, as I haven't done that often for years, having been a student there for 6.5 years, or 6 and a term, there are places you suddenly go and you think, oh, that was the room I had in my final year as an undergraduate, this sort of thing. And you just remember there was somebody learning to play the tuba. So I never quite worked out who it was, but at the very early stages, when there's a lot of repetition and things going wrong, there was one particular piece, whoever it was, couldn't quite get right. They were, even as they improved, there was just that one thing where you knew it was going to go wrong. And it built up hearing it time and time again. And anyway, but other things that happened, bumping into old friends they remember, I don't, and vice versa. So we have to be a little bit careful with memories, and it's easy to remember. Again, my parents were very keen on photography, but also cinefilm in those days, it was all before video cameras and the like. And I'm left not sure whether there are some memories that I have because I was shown film of them later on, or some that I really remember, because some of these things I think I can remember when I'm very, very young indeed, but I do wonder if it's been prompted. So again, that can, in that case, it should be a genuine memory because it's film of a real thing, but sometimes a story being repeated, people can start to believe that they saw that as well. So it's complicated. There are clearly a lot of accurate information, and it's obviously it would be an infernal cheek for any of us to say to someone who was actually there that, oh no, you're getting it wrong, when we weren't. But on the other hand, there are also bits where human beings being human beings, we do start to remember things or repeat things because they're a good story, because we've half imagined it, or because we've added to it, and our memory fails as well, and some things we just don't remember. And you find a lot of people that sometimes their sense of timing, they remember bits of it really precisely, but they can't quite work out what happened in between. That's faded off. Anyway, let's get on to our topic for today, and this is a Roman senior officer telling us a little bit about a battle that he was in. And it's not a huge amount, but it's within the collection of Cicero's letters. It's from the letters to his friends, the Ad Familiares, book 1030, and it's one of the few from Galba. He doesn't feature much. Now, we'll talk more in another video about the Battle of Forum Gallorum, which is what we're talking about on in April 43 BC. In fact, this in a sense, this is a shortish video, although I've already rambled for 36 hours or whatever it is to get here. in a sense, it's a preview for two different things that may turn into series. So I do want to do something on Roman commanders, how the command system worked in the Roman army, what Roman generals and senior officers actually did at some point. And I'm also thinking about doing a series looking at individual battles, possibly in a fairly eccentric order, because it'll be ones where I've done some work on the particular book, so I can gather the references quickly and just think they're interesting. So we might do videos on, we'll do one on Forum Gallorum, we might do, I was wondering about doing one on the River Granicus with Alexander, that might be interesting, and then various others. We'll potter through some of the more famous ones from the Punic Wars, Caesar's campaigns, that sort of thing. Maybe some sieges as well. I'd like to do something on the Siege of Jerusalem in AD 70, and I've over the years written and thought about various things to do with that, so there are a couple of angles we might take there. Don't worry for those who are, we're partway through the series on grand strategy. I will get back to that when I've got proper time and the headspace to cope with it. At the moment, I'm full of proofreading, checking things, putting together bibliographies. I'm going to do a chronology, all this sort of thing. And it's all got to be done within the next week because they've moved my deadline forward for good reasons, but nevertheless it's meant that I'm definitely in headless chicken mode at the moment. So we will get back to grand strategy, we will finish that off. There are various other things as well we'll be doing as well, along with some of the other themes we've got before, but these two are some additions that we might well add. So we won't go into an awful lot of detail about the Battle of Forum Gallorum today, other than the basics. It's part of a civil war, so you've got Romans on both sides. So let's look at what's in the letter, and we'll go through it. We won't read the whole text, but we'll quote some of it and we'll summarise the other bits. So it starts off, Sergius Sulpicius Galba to Cicero, and in castris ad Mutinam, so in the camp near Mutina in northern Italy, Decimus Brutus, the cousin of the famous Marcus Junius Brutus, had holed up there with several legions, been besieged by Antony, and forces controlled by the Senate and the consuls Hirtius and Pansa, assisted by the young Caesar Octavian, had gone north to relieve Decimus Brutus. Decimus Brutus had served with Caesar in Gaul, as had Galba. And he gets a few mentions in the commentaries, and he's one of those men who's decided to join the conspiracy, because he's another, like Decimus Brutus, he's another of Caesar's assassins, and seems to have been disappointed. Caesar obviously didn't give him quite what he expected. Maybe there's just that very traditional senatorial view where we simply shouldn't have a dictator. There should not be one man with supreme power. So he switches sides, and like all those other conspirators, he doesn't live all that long to regret it. But at this point, things are going quite well for them. And then you've got the date, 17th day before the calends of May, so 15th of April, as we would put it, 43 BC. That's because, you've got this system of dating things to before or after, the calends, the ides, and so on, all the knowns. Now, he starts to put a bit of background in. Again, we'll go into this in far more detail when we do something actually on the battle, because it is an interesting one, and we have this account, we have some stuff from Appian and elsewhere that's quite, so we can talk about it in reasonable detail, and it's an interesting, rather fluid meeting encounter. So, Galba explains that he was with Pansa, one of the consuls, again another one of Caesar's men, as is Hirtius. They weren't part of the conspiracy, they hadn't murdered Julius Caesar, but they'd been marked down for the consulship of 43 BC, and they don't side with Antony. Essentially, they're willing to operate against him. Pansa's on his way to join the other consul, Hirtius, who's already in the area. Both Hirtius and Pansa have recruited legions in recent months. So they have inexperienced troops. Maybe some of the officers have got some experience, but these are basically very raw legions, and this will be emphasized again. Now, on the 14th of April, so this is the day before the letter is written. So this letter is written within 24 hours of the battle that it describes, which again gives it that immediacy that we simply don't get anywhere else in what survives, though we know that this sort of material was around. So Antony has attacked Pansa with 2 legions, the 2nd and the 35th, plus 2 Praetorian cohorts and some evocati. This is what Galba tells us. Now, evocati, that's recalled men, men who've already served their time, been honourably discharged, have been recalled. Again, I know some people are getting a bit miffed about all the stuff about TV, but you do have Vorenus is called an Evocatus in that HBO Rome series. It's actually quite a vague status, and we don't really know what we're talking about here, other than these are veterans, so they're presumably men who've served before, and quite probably a lot of them in Caesar's army, at least at some stage, because bear in mind nearly everybody who's fought in the Civil War, if they're not dead or just run away, end up being recruited into Caesar's army, just as Octavian's army, Augustus's army, will be everybody, 60 odd legions by the time the aftermath of Actium, because everybody's defected and joined you. So they're a mixed bag, but they are, how many they are, how they're organised, it's like the beneficiarii that Caesar described Pompey as having at the Battle of Pharsalus. We don't really know an awful lot about them and quite how this works. Another interesting thing, 2 Praetorian cohorts. Now obviously the Praetorian Guard, formed by Augustus and then have their somewhat dubious career under the successive emperors as kingmakers, really. They're supposed to be the bodyguard. We know about them. They are eventually formed into 9 cohorts under Augustus, so just short of a legion size. They're talked about quite a bit in this Civil War period, not so much with Caesar and Pompey, but in the aftermath. That probably means they've been around and just not been talked about. And obviously the Praetorium is the headquarters, and you have the old tradition from Polybius of the extraordinari, picked troops from the allied contingents who were kept at the immediate disposal of the army commander, the consul, the praetor, whoever it might be, and camped near his HQ, his tent, that area. They seem to be, again, the pick of the bunch, the idea that maybe they're bigger, maybe they're taller, maybe they're just more experienced, more confident, better soldiers. There is, however, some hint that you equip them rather differently. Now, what that means, they appear to fight just like legionaries, so we're assuming their body armour, helmet, scutum, pilum, gladius sword, all that sort of thing. However, it's noted that, for instance, later on, Octavia will take to Antony several cohorts equipped as Praetorians, rather than the far more larger number of troops and legions that he actually wanted. But so they're elite, they're prestigious. Maybe it's just the equipment's fancier. Maybe there's some other distinction. We don't quite know, but obviously you could tell them apart. You could tell a Praetorian cohort from a legionary cohort, but we're just not quite sure how. Now, Antony attacks because he thinks that he's facing only panzer with 4 newly raised legions. Galba describes them as tirones. A tyro was a raw recruit, somebody who's just joined the army, or learning anything, really. It's, however, what Antony doesn't know is that during the night, Legio Martia, now this is one of the veteran legions that have rallied to Octavian, the young Caesar, as he should be called, really. We don't call him that because it confuses with Julius Caesar, but it's like the dismissive comment, the boy who owes everything to a name. He matters because he is a Julius Caesar, because he has taken that name as part of Caesar's will. He's interpreting it much more widely than that he's the heir of Caesar in every respect politically, and not just his money and personal fortune. But the reason that a lot of experienced troops will come out of retirement and join him, that other units are able, like the Martia, to be basically persuaded to defect from Antony, with incentives, very strong financial ones, is that he has that name Caesar, and that association, and that men who'd been part of Caesar's machine, really, part of his camp, his headquarters, a lot of them, his financiers, they will come to help the young Caesar, and that's part of this, which makes it possible. So the veteran unit, this has arrived during the night. Curiously enough, Galba describes this as which used to be under my command, and not quite sure when. We don't hear of the Legio Martia in the civil war between Caesar and the Pompeians, but it's probably around. And we hear of it in this civil war period, partly because of the defection and then subsequently. So when is this? Is this part of the civil war campaigns? Has it been around? Is this a nickname for a unit that's been around and they use it in preference to their number for some time? Does it not have a number? When has Galba commanded? But there's clearly some association. He seems to expect that to continue. He's also 2 Praetorian cohorts have arrived. So it's the same thing as Antony adding these 2, I suppose it's like, combined grenadiers in the 18th, early 19th century or something like that. The sense this is an elite unit. They're basically legionaries, but a bit better in some way, but as we say, distinctive. So, Antony is taking on more than he's bargained for. Now, when Antony's cavalry came into sight, this is the first part we're going to quote, there was no holding Legio Martia and the Praetorian cohorts. So what happens is that Antony attacks, and then the veteran units, the confident units, will not stay just outside the camp or in the camp and wait and defend it. They steam off towards Antony at some distance. These are visible from some distance. This is not going immediately into combat. So you've seen a formation maybe a mile away, maybe more, maybe you've seen the dust. We started to follow them any old how, since we'd not been able to hold them back. So Galba and presumably the raw legions start to follow them with Panzer as well. That's, again, we'll come back to a bigger picture of the battle. But this is the personal account, the personal perspective, telling Cicero what's happened, reporting on a victory, but also, trying to give some idea of what was going on. Now, this is interesting because, again, we have this very idea of tight discipline in the Roman army, and they always do what they're told. So you have this situation where Caesar's troops are eager to get the civil war over with. They want to fight the Pompeians. They're confident. They think they're the best in the world. They want to attack. He tries to stop them. He rides around trying to control the battle line, and some soldiers pressure one of the trumpeters at Cornican to sound the signal to advance. Others take up the signal, and the army starts moving, and Caesar gives the order formally and rides with them and starts the battle, so make sure everybody is moving. So again, particularly in civil war situations, we've got to remember that discipline isn't always as perfect, and that also the Roman army does emphasize aggression. So it's not just this sort of machine-like automata, this idea that you simply do, you point in the right direction. Again, the big battle scene, the big advance in the Spartacus movie, where they don't have any orders, they just come forward, checkerboard formation, do the formidable battle line, all this sort of thing, without anybody doing anything. There is great emphasis on discipline, control, but it doesn't always win out. And you get these moments of enthusiastic advances, particularly in civil wars. And remember, these armies have been put together very quickly. Legio Martia has been under Antony's command, or under direct command of his brother, but brought back to Italy until comparatively recently. It's only just arrived. Presumably none of its officers know, particularly the officers in Panzer's army. Galba says that he does know Legio Martia. The Praetorian cohorts have come up. So again, the Praetorians and Legio Martia steam off in some sort of order. Presumably their officers are going with them, but nevertheless it's not tightly controlled by the commander-in-chief. So Panzer sends 2 legions after Legio Martia. We'll learn that a few lines down. Now Antony has advanced with his cavalry and his light troops. This levis armatura is the Latin. Now, they've not been mentioned at all. See, Galba's talked about the 2 legions plus the Praetorian cohorts. Suddenly we get cavalry and light troops, light infantry, probably. Or a mixture, perhaps there are some light cavalry as well, that just appear. Now again, that's a reflection. It's partly a reflection of you're just telling a story, and you don't sort of start very methodically, they had this, they had that, there's so many of these, and this is what we were doing. You're assuming as well a fair bit of knowledge in the person you're corresponding with, so that they know to fill in the gaps, they know what to expect. So Antony was trying to convince the opposition. All he had was the cavalry and light troops, luring them forward. And obviously it's worked, because Martia and the 2 Praetorian cohorts have gone forward. 2 legions go on in support, eventually having passed through marshes and woods. So there's quite some distance and difficult terrain to get to. So this isn't just, we formed in a battle line, off we go, we're there into contact. Like rather more ancient battles, there is an element of formality in quite a few battles, but there are others that develop as much more sort of looser meeting engagements, where you're bumping into each other and improvising as you go along, rather than everybody's formed up in perfect order as the general wants at the start against another army in the same situation. That happens, but that's not the be-all and end-all of battles in the ancient world. So Martia and the two Praetorian cohorts, and this he seems to say 12 cohorts in all. Which he does. So this implies Martia is at full strength. Now, given that it was one of the legions that had been over in Macedonia under the command of Antony's brother, waiting originally there to form part of Caesar's army to go on the Parthian expedition. Balkan one first and then the Parthian expedition. So again, Marty has been around for a while, it's just we don't hear about it until this Civil War period. So again, when Galba's connection with it had happened, we don't really know. They seem to form in an achies. He talks, it rather implies it formed in one line. Might not be, but that seems to be the implication. And once they've done that, Antony brings out his legions and attacks, resulting in a fierce fight. So they are heavily outnumbered, more than 2 to 1. So Galba goes on. But the right wing, where I was placed with 8 cohorts of Legio Martia, threw back Antony's Legio 33 at the first charge, and advanced more than half a mile from its original position in the line. Now, it may well be that the line isn't as balanced as it should be. You know, he's got 8 cohorts out of the 12 they've got overall. So you've got the Praetorians and a couple of other from the Legion over on the left. Presumably it's the right, not right wing, and there's a centre as well, but just the right side of it. And Galba implies that he's in charge of this part of the battle line, not necessarily the whole battle line. So there might be somebody else in charge of the other 4 cohorts. They come up against Legio 33, throw them back at the first charge. So Antony's men have formed a line and faced them. Now again, we'll come back to this when we look at the battle in detail. Bear in mind, as you would in a modern period, when the 51st Highland Division advances against the 90th Light Division of Rommel's Africa Corps, whatever it might be, we use these as shorthand. It doesn't mean every element of each division is actually there and is in contact. You have to take that same assumption into ancient accounts as well. Just because we mention a big unit doesn't mean that absolutely everybody's there and that it's already arrived. Because again, this is a meeting engagement. Antony has held his men back, is now sending them forward. So how much of this, as far as Galba is concerned, he's met the 33rd Legion, which presumably he can recognise by standards, insignia, patterns on shields, this sort of thing. Perhaps more than that. Perhaps he knows some of the officers, because after all, he's been part of the same army until recently. Maybe they're shouting out that they're the 33rd. Who knows? But he clearly thinks that this is the people he's fighting. Now, again, in a lot of more recent accounts of battles, you sometimes misidentify the enemy. You sometimes get it wrong. In this sort of situation, you'd think there's a reasonable chance he'd get it right, but nevertheless. And then they've pushed back half a mile. So again, a reminder that there's sometimes this tendency, and with the diagrams we see, that put everything in a very short distance. Again, go back to the one I did on Cannae with the Invicta folk, where they've tried to give a sense of scale by actually laying the thing out and the number of people to give an idea of how much space some of these formations might take out. But again, Cannae is a fairly ordered battle, at least to start off with, whereas Forum Gallorum is much more confused and fluid. But we do get cases of this. The Caesar's battle against the Helvetii, part of the Gallic line, retires again. I can't remember if it's half a mile or a mile. It's a considerable distance, and is followed up fairly gradually by Caesar's men, who then come under threat from a flank attack, and they're saved by the third line. So you do have some quite big manoeuvres in ancient battles. So you do have to be careful about saying, well, they could only move a short distance. So Galba's pushed forward with his 8 cohorts. Some or all of the 33rd, he believes, are in front of him and are giving way in front of him. But, they haven't routed all together. They're pursuing them, but they presumably have not caught up with them. So it might even be that, the first advance is enough to persuade this unit to retreat, thinking, well, we don't actually need to be here. Who knows? Anyway, as I say, we'll come back to all of this when we look at the battle in more detail in a different video at some point in the future. So Galba continues. The cavalry then tried to surround our right wing, so I started to retire, setting our light troops, again, he's not mentioned these at all as being there, against the Moorish cavalry to stop them attacking our men in the rear. Mauritanian is the word used. I think rather than Maori, but I can't quite remember. I'll look at the Latin when I get a chance. So that might mean that when he's talking about these light armed troops with Antony, that Antony has light armed cavalry as well, because traditionally the Moors are like the javelin skirmishers, ride in quick, pepper you with missiles, ride out again. So Galba doesn't seem to have any cavalry of his own, though he does have these light troops. Quite who they are, maybe some are mounted, maybe some are not, but they're having trouble. He's advanced, he's been pulled forward, his flank is now threatened. Again, is this part of Antony's plan? Is this just a happy chance as far as Antony's concerned? Because again, how much order and planning was this? How much confusion? How much are things developing? But it gives us a sense. Perhaps this was a particularly confused battle, but even so, it reminds us that even the ones that we think of as very ordered and very neat probably weren't, from the perspective of the participants. Like most battles, they were pretty chaotic events. Now, here's where it gets particularly interesting for me. I've always had this fascination with just what Roman commanders do. Now, here we have Galba talking. Meanwhile, I found myself in the thick of the Antonians, with Antony some distance behind me. All at once I rode at a gallop towards a legion of recruits which was on its way up from our camp, throwing my shield over my shoulders. The Antonians chased me, while our men were about to hurl their pealer. In this predicament, some providence came to my rescue. I was quickly recognized by our men. Just read it through in one go, but let's go back and dissect this a little bit. So Galba has ended up in the middle of, or in the midst of, the Antonian army. So again, there is a tendency, particularly with neat blocks, neat lines on a map, to think in terms of very formal, very densely packed battle lines. And there is this big debate, something we'll come back to another time when we look at yet another topic that I'm promising to look at sometime, which is how combat actually works, how people do fight in these battles. You have a debate about how much space there is between units and how neat units remain in formation as the battle goes on. And this is something relevant for all of ancient warfare, and we need to consider, are there differences, are there similarities, is there just a general pattern when people fight in these sorts of combats, or was, say, phalanx warfare very, very different from Roman warfare in absolutely every respect, and not just in some. All of these are big, big issues that I talk about a bit in the Pharos lecture series that'll come out. I'll talk about even more in probably my next book after the one I'm doing will be on ancient warfare, but we'll see about that, whether it's early days at the moment. Nothing is yet settled, but that seems to be one of the favourites for all concerned, and I quite fancy doing it, so we'll see. This to me suggests quite open, fluid fighting where you do have significant gaps in the battle line. It is not simply a mile or more long of shoulder to shoulder with only perhaps very small gaps, which is what we all too often imagine. Now again, you could say Forum Gallorum is an untypical battle because it's particularly confused, but nevertheless it's interesting. Somehow or other, Sulpicius Galba has ended up in the enemy army rather than his own. Now again, part of this maybe he's been talking about these cavalry, these Moors that are galloping around, the light infantry as well that are threatening him. So these, again, he is after all a Roman officer. Clearly a senior officer from the sort of outfit he's wearing, on a good horse, galloping around, perhaps with a few members of staff. He rather implies he's alone, but whether that's really the case or whether he's just assuming, well, of course, there's my bodyguard, my attendant, my clerk, and, a tribune or two who always trail around to carry out my orders, this sort of thing. But he implies he's alone. It's probably not maybe it's a knot of horsemen, maybe he has got detached altogether from that. Now it could be that he's in the dust confusion of cavalry. Cavalry are always, particularly these skirmishing cavalry, going back and forth, harassing, advancing, shooting, retiring, this sort of thing. And he's within that. Or it might be that he's within the legionary line. In either case, though, it does imply that you could do this, that you could pass through. Now in a civil war in particular, the enemy looks exactly like you, so when Galba's in the middle of them, if people don't know him individually or they're not paying that much attention, then they're not going to know. He's just a Roman officer, and it's, it reminds me of two things. One is I think it's Asterix the Legionary, where they're in a test judo at one point, and you hear all these speech bubbles, or you see all these speech bubbles rather, of people arguing, is this Caesar's test judo? No, it's Pompey's, and all this sort of thing, and nobody knows who's who and what's going on. And also the number of mistakes made in a lot of warfare of more recent periods, where people end up mistaking the enemy because they're, you're not expecting them to be there. There's one particularly, it was rather a sad incident at the Battle of Lundy's Lane in the War of 1812, which started later in the day and ended up being fought in twilight and then at night. I remember reading this account where a British sergeant from one of the infantry battalions comes up to a group of mounted officers that he assumes is his own to report, and is made a POW straight away, because actually he's come up to the American commander without realising, but as far as he's concerned, it's some dude on a horse with a bicorn hat who looks authoritative, and particularly, obviously, your perception of colour has gone considerably. But anyway, it's a confused night action, and he's ended up, and the poor man is upset because he thinks he's being accused of desertion, whereas he's been arrested because he's in the wrong army and he's an enemy. But that's the sense of this sort of confusion that's going on, but it does rather hint at quite a fluid battle line. And again, this will be reinforced by some of the incidents we get from Caesar and elsewhere when we come to look at all this in more detail. Now, we'll just jump down a line or so. Throwing my shield over my shoulders, he mentions. Now that, of course, brings to mind Caesar's famous account of the Battle of the Sabis from 57 BC, where he arrives to rally part of the line that's in serious trouble and takes a shield from one of the men in the rear ranks because he hadn't brought his own. This is a surprise attack by the Belgic tribes. Those really are about the only two pieces of evidence that suggest that Roman commanders in this period routinely carried a shield of some sort. It's not depicted in art. You do occasionally get these rhetorical things that a great general could fight with sword and shield and maneuver those and manipulate those as well as he could an entire army, and vice versa, and all this sort of thing. And Trajan gets, you have some Pliny's panegyric talks about this with Trajan as tribune and all this sort of thing. But it's interesting because otherwise, artistically, the Romans follow the Hollywood convention in that Roman generals are nearly always depicted bareheaded, and they'll have a cuirass on and a sword, but otherwise they tend not to be armed or protected in any way, because you want to recognise them. It's, this is the famous man. Trajan's like this all the time on Trajan's column and elsewhere. The Adam Clissi monument, where he seems to appear, this sort of thing, the Trajanic frieze. So that's an interesting little detail. We don't know what shape, what sort of shield. Presumably it's not likely to be a scutum, because he clearly talks about galloping. He's on horseback, even though, again, he hasn't told us this. He can assume that Cicero would realise, well, any senior commander is going to be on horseback. It would be the exception if he was not. We have a case of Caesar sending his horse away in the battle against the Helvetii, of Marius on one occasion fighting on foot. But generally speaking, you're mounted because that means you can move around the battlefield, you can get to the right place at the right time, and also you can see that little bit more. It's only adding 5 feet or so extra to your height, but that makes quite a difference, particularly to see over men on foot and to see over hedges and things like this. So you'd assume something smaller, maybe round, maybe oval, probably flat rather than the curved scutum, and a bit less heavy, you would think. So maybe it's like the sort of shields we get depicted for standard bearers and people later on, but who knows? But anyway, it's an interesting little detail. So anyway, let's go back to the start of that sentence. All at once I rode at a gallop towards a legion of recruits on its way up from our camp. And that's when he throws his shield behind his back. Means that if they've got their shield, they've got the option of fighting hand to hand. But I think also perhaps something that we need to remember as well, there are a lot of missiles being thrown around, and it gives you at least some opportunity to protect yourself. You've got other people around you. You've got shield bearers get described with Scipio Aemilianus to the Emperor Julian later on, and others at different times. So there are probably men there whose job it is to look after you, but also you've got that option yourself. And do remember as well that missiles in ancient battles, they're relatively low velocity. You can, on the whole, see them coming, although it was harder with sling bullets, so you have a bit more chance to react and block than you would with, being shot with a musket, let alone a high-velocity rifle. Yes, the Antonians chased me while our men were about to hurl their peeler. So basically, you've got Galba galloping like blazes, trying to get back to his own lines because he's being chased by a lot of Antonians who finally realise that this fellow who's suddenly sort of obviously gone white, well, one assumes gone white as a sheet, turned him. yanked his horse around and galloping off back towards the enemy isn't one of us, or somebody's recognised him, whatever it may be. But again, he's being chased and now becomes the danger. In this predicament, some providence came to my rescue. I was quickly recognised by our own men. He clearly felt he was in danger of being impaled on a pilum thrown by one of his own men. We're getting into, again, but think, okay, it was a picket line after a battle, but Stonewall Jackson, there have been plenty of cases of mistakes of friendly fire, and after all, it's a civil war. Galba could just as easily be interpreted as the heroic, possibly drunk enemy senior commander who's leading the charge far out in front, that's attacking you, rather than one of your own trying to get back to security of your own lines. But he does make it, he doesn't get killed. After that, the battle's going against the outnumbered forces of Panzer with the weak wings. That's 2 cohorts of Martier and Praetorian cohort. They're being surrounded, or Praetorian cohorts rather, being surrounded by cavalry, which is Antony's strongest arm, he says. So Panzer starts to order a retreat. And when all our ranks had withdrawn, I started to retreat to the camp, the last to do so. So, Galba gives himself quite a heroic gloss on this, and perhaps deservedly, perhaps not, that, and probably the troops of the Marty would be better suited to covering the retreat than the raw recruits. Or maybe he's with the raw recruits, he's joined, maybe he's completely detached now from the troops he had under his command at the start of the battle. Interesting, again, the emphasis on cavalry, because the Galba and Panzer don't seem to have any, or at least they don't mention any of theirs, but then those light troops just pop up from nowhere. Perhaps they had fewer, perhaps they had none. The flanks are vulnerable. That left wing seems weaker from the start, because Galba talks about facing the 33rd Legion, but there's the other legion with Antony's men. So have you left 4 cohorts to face 10 or the equivalent, or a much heavier force? They withdraw, they cover the withdrawal. Antony pursues them to some extent, but he doesn't want to attack the camp. Again, interesting, we'll look at this in the context of when we look in more detail at the battle. He withdraws, he appears from this, but particularly from Appian, to withdraw not in the best of order, because he's not expecting any more fighting, and perhaps his men are tired. It may also reflect the fact that these are civil war armies. They're not always as readily disciplined as they might be at other times, because you've got to, basically each side is outbidding the other to get the loyalty of these men. Yes, you partly say, well, I knew Julius Caesar, I was his fan and all this sort of thing, and that's why he come to me, but it's also a lot about money. And the other thing is the armies are being cobbled together, so even if Antony knows some of the people before, to put together a staff that, even on the Roman standard of not that many people, but know who everybody is, know who's in charge of this cohort, who's in charge of that legion, what's going on. And to operate as a smooth team, it's much harder to put that together in a civil war situation where you've fragmented. The command structure that might have existed, might have been in place, and Caesar had planned for his army he was going to lead on his Parthian expedition. Those people have gone to different sides. So some are still with you, some are not. You're trying to get things going again. And this is a different sort of fighting. So there's a lot of irregularity going on, because Antony bumps into Hirtius and the other army that's coming up and is badly mauled as a result. By that stage he's probably outnumbered, but he's also in a poor state to fight a battle. So we'll again look at the context of the battle in more detail at another time, and we'll also, the main theme for today was just to point people out, because this is not a terribly well-known passage from Latin literature, that we have the account of a commander written a day after the battle. And as always, it's frustrating the things he doesn't tell us, because the things he assumed Cicero would know without having to be told. So, you can work some of them out. He's suddenly on horseback because he's galloping back to the line. Again, Cicero would have known, well, that's what generals do, so obviously. But afterwards, you've got the little, the troops that suddenly appear that he hasn't talked about, but that sense of, he's clearly implies he's been in charge of a section of the battle line and not in charge of the rest, and Panzer presumably has overall responsibility when he arrives, when he's got there, whether he's gone with the early ones. He's talked about this other legion arriving. He's talked about the confusion of battle, that he ends up amidst the enemy's soldiers rather than his own, and gets chased back, then nearly gets killed by his own people. So interesting stuff about the confusion. It does fit with, if you could find lots of eyewitness accounts of a Napoleonic battle that would be very similar in flavour, where somebody's talking about the things they remember, the things they've decided are significant. And if you're anything like me, I don't write too many letters these days. I'm afraid I've got terribly lazy, and it tends to be emails and the like. But when you've had a phone conversation with someone, a friend, you haven't caught up with for years, you often remember something. Oh, I meant to say that to them afterwards, and you've just forgotten by this time. So it has that selective element that is not the whole story. It's not the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And it's his version of it, so other people might tell things differently. Perhaps Panzer, had he had the chance, would be emphasizing his role, not talking about Sulpicius Galba. So Galba may well have emphasized his own conduct, his own importance, his own significance in this battle, but he does appear to be in charge of 2/3 of the troops that begin the initial engagement. So that is significant. He doesn't really tell us what he's doing in that role, other than we attacked and the enemy gave way, and then I ended up, we were getting threatened by the cavalry, and I ended up in amongst the enemy troops. So he's not talking about what's your job as a commander, because again, he'd assume that people like Cicero would know, or at least know as much as they cared to know, about what was actually done on these occasions. So always eyewitness accounts tend to be frustrating. They're very partial. As Wellington said, you're only seeing your corner of the ball. You're seeing the things that matter to you. And obviously, understandably, Galba's had a bit of a shock. He's ended up in the enemy army. He's escaped, nearly got mown down by his own men, and then managed to escape that. And then, best of all, this battle that hasn't gone too well for them, they've ended up having to retreat, has been saved because the other armies turned up and Antony's taken a beating later in the day. So things have actually turned around. So this is a victory he can report, and sending your letter in, it's good for you to get the news in first because that pitches your story, but also you associate yourself very heavily with this victory that's occurred. And it's a practical thing as well. They're all on the same side. It's useful for people at Rome to know. So there are lots of different ways of looking at this. But all in all, it's fascinating because it is that glimpse. And it's a glimpse of a lot of material that once existed and simply has not survived, that occasionally gets mentioned by somebody like Plutarch in a biography, but they'll quote a particular incident. Occasionally gets thrown into the narrative accounts that you get with those other eyewitnesses like Josephus, like Ammianus, people like that, but is very, very rare. And to have somebody from this period who's not Julius Caesar giving an account of a battle someone who was there, is particularly useful and particularly interesting. So anyway, that's a little bit of something unusual, an extra source, an eyewitness account of a battle by a Roman general, something that we have so little of this sort of material. And to give us an idea of the way they might describe things, the way people felt they would understand what was happening, and what one of these officers might find himself up to, not in detail, but we can start to think about, well, he's there with the battle line. He's obviously fairly far forward because he ends up too far forward during the advance. Now, all of that, again, we'll put into context. We'll put far more on looking more widely about what we do learn about what different Roman commanders and senior subordinates actually do from these little nuggets of information that are tucked away in various wider accounts, from the other descriptions, from some of the theoretical books, all this sort of thing. So all that's to come someday. But anyway, this for the moment is a straight history one, even if a sort of fairly niche subject, and looking in some detail at a fairly small piece of evidence, a fairly brief piece of evidence. But that's it for this week. Next week, I'm not quite sure. I hope to have something up. I do hope to keep on doing something every Wednesday, but I'm not quite sure what it's going to be. By June, hopefully it'll be back to something more detailed, more structured, and we can continue things like the grand strategy, Conquered and the Proud, all that sort of stuff. And maybe, hopefully as well, we might get another interview in by then, but we'll see how that goes. But anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for watching.